Hi, everyone. Thanks for checking out the Safe Travels podcast. My name is Joey. Today, we are at Rocky Mountain National Park, and I had the pleasure of sitting down with Will Deacy. Will is the large mammal ecologist here at Rocky Mountain. And in this episode, we talk all about the many large mammals that live here and the interactions they have with this incredible landscape. Will, I'm so excited to talk with you. Thank you for joining me. You are a large mammal ecologist here at beautiful Rocky Mountain National Park. I know you've had quite the journey to get to this park, so if you don't mind sharing what your journey's been like prior to arriving here at Rocky Mountain.
Yeah, for sure. So I grew up like so many people visiting national parks when I was a kid. Grew up in Kansas City, so we drive out to places like Rocky Mountain National Park. But it wasn't until towards the end of undergrad that I became aware that like you could do field work, like that was an option for a career. And as soon as I learned that, I started kind of up the chain of different animals. So the first species I worked with was stick bugs in California. And then later I worked on red foxes, wolves, ended up in Alaska where I worked on brown bears up there in Kodiak. Eventually did my PhD on Kodiak bears and their interactions with salmon. And then later I worked in the Arctic parks in Alaska. So Gates of the Arctic Park and some parks further west on grizzly bear populations and Dall sheep populations. And from there I moved down here to study mostly elk and moose.
That's quite the journey. You have to share a stick bug fact that stands out to you.
Yeah, so those are a little funny because it's not like we were really interested in stick bugs in themselves. They were a model for understanding evolution, but these were not the stick bugs you can picture that look like sticks. They're like little Tamima stick insects, and they have a different form for each plant that they live on. So that's why we're looking at them. Yeah.
Here at the park, you do a lot of research with elk and moose, but you just mentioned a whole bunch of different species that you've spent a lot of time studying and spending time with.
Yeah.
Do your prior research studies, does that help inform you on maybe the work that you're doing here with the elk and moose?
I think the main thing, and it goes back to the training I have, which is in systems ecology, is just that no matter what system you focus on, like for example, studying grizzly bears, people are like, oh, you must be focused completely on the grizzly bears, but really you're focused on all the other species that they're interacting with because all these ecosystems are super connected, and to understand like a focal species, like a grizzly bear or an elk, you have to look at all the species that they interact with and touch. So I think just like working with all the variety of species gives me a pretty broad base to draw on when I enter a new system like this.
I think oftentimes when I'm thinking about national parks and people see photos of national parks, you get that iconic photo that caught my eye of brown bears and salmon. What was that experience like for you at Kodiak, studying bears and, you know, the interactions with salmon? Was that kind of like a legacy project for you getting your PhD?
Yeah, it was amazing. So I was working with an amazing friend, Bill Leacock, and we were living on an island in a lake on Kodiak Island. And we'd like float plane all of our stuff out there and live out there for, 3, 4, 5 months at a time. And get our supplies flown in, but then we're just surrounded by bears. So Kodiak has a bear per square mile. And so like we saw bears every day, and oftentimes we saw them up close because Kodiak is kind of like the big city for bears. They're really tolerant, and we could spend lots of time close by with them. So that was like the first time where instead of hopping from project to project, which is what early career scientists in wildlife biology often do, I got to spend many seasons in the same place and like build knowledge and learn more and more. And what normally happens is you do a research project in the first year. Normally what happens is like your project doesn't really work the first year. And so then the second year you can fix it. But also you ask a question, answer that, and then like 5 more questions pop up, and you get to choose 1 or 2 of those and ask that the second year. And so you can really expand how much you understand the system when you're there for 5 or 6 years. So that was the first time I got to do that, which was cool.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
After spending so much time with brown bears in that type of environment, is it hard for you to now be in an environment that doesn't have the brown bear? There's obviously black bears here in the park, not a ton of them, which we'll talk about.
Yeah.
But is it hard for you to not be around a species that you're so familiar with now?
I wouldn't say it's hard because there is still so much cool stuff going on here. but I have such a soft spot for grizzlies and spending time near them and watching them. So yeah, I'll definitely go back up there at some point, especially because I have a daughter, and so I'd like to go back to Kodiak and show her some of the cool stuff out there. But the other big thing is my wife did all my field work with me, and so it was a special place for both of us.
Oh, that's so cool. And I'm sure it'll be neat when you go back, and not for work, but to be able to recreate and have such an understanding of the environment and the species.
Yeah.
So I'm sure that'll be a great time for you.
Yeah, for sure.
So as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, you are a large mammal ecologist, and that is your title here at the park. So what all does that entail, and what team do you get to work with here?
Yeah, so it's a simple title, but there's a lot of different things that I do. So one big thing is I work with the other wildlife branch at the park, which is conservation biology. They're focused on like rare, threatened, endangered species, but together we do wildlife response with law enforcement. So a big thing, because we have over 4 million visitors here, is just there's a lot of people out there seeing wildlife, and so oftentimes there might be like a sick animal that people report. And it could be as simple as like a bat, like a sick bat that's on a trail. And so we together go out and respond to that and make sure that it's not a bat that has rabies that could threaten a visitor, or if an animal gets tangled up in a fence or something like that, then we might go out and use anesthesia to release it, that kind of thing. So wildlife response is one part of it. With my team specifically, and we're about 7 people this year, we focus on understanding moose, elk, wolves, how they interact, but then really specifically how their interactions affect wetlands in the park. Because the park has a long legacy of problems with wetlands. Like, we've just progressively lost more and more wetlands, and so it's a priority for the park to restore them.
And what is the importance of wetlands in an ecosystem and environment like this?
Yeah, it's a great question, because people are like, the name wetlands is not very good marketing, because it makes people think like, I don't want to go in there because like I'm going to get wet, and people don't like that. But they're critically important, especially in the arid West. So in places with lots of water, they're less important, but here they're about 4% of the park, but they really pack way above their weight, or they punch way above their weight in terms of like their impacts for biodiversity. So good stats are like 65% of the rare plants in the park are in wetlands. There's tons of small birds, passerine birds, that live in wetlands, and wetlands have a ton of benefits for fish as well. So it's these small areas that have these big benefits. The other thing is that they have lots of benefits for people. So fire is a big issue in the West. Fires are increasing in size and frequency, and wetlands, when they're intact and they're functioning really, really well, they can stay wet even despite a long drought. And they can then serve as a fire break if a big intense fire comes through. That can allow firefighters to gain a foothold, or just like have a break from a super intense fire that comes through.
And how about the biodiversity that wetlands are able to harbor?
Yeah, so that's as an ecologist, that's the reason why I always knew that wetlands were important. They just have lots of, because they're so different than a lot of the dry areas, they can just support different species than those other areas. So they just have like a super dense set of different species that can live in that small area compared to other areas.
And in this park, wetlands are threatened by some of the large mammals that are here. What are those large mammals that are threatening those wetlands?
Yeah, so historically, elk have been the issue. Just too many elk that were living in the park for long periods of time, and elk aren't really thought of as animals that eat like the 2 key wetland species of plants, so aspen and willow. But when they live here in the winter and the ground gets covered in snow, they can have pretty big effects on willow. And the history of elk in the park is pretty interesting, and it's a kind of an important part of the ecological history. And the key thing is that when settlers moved here, the elk were hunted to extinction locally for meat. Basically, they were market hunted, and that's not that surprising, considering like elk are delicious. People love hunting them, and once they were hunted to extinction, and there were no elk here, at the same time, wolves and grizzly bears were hunted to extinction. And so once the elk were brought back actually relocated from Yellowstone National Park, their population exploded because instead of being regulated by hunting, because we don't have hunting in this park, it's illegal in the park, and grizzly bears and wolves, there was just nothing capping that population. Population exploded, and pretty quickly the park was like, oh my God, we have way too many elk. And starting in the 50s and 60s, they started doing some population control. So they were culling elk in the park. They were capturing elk and relocating them to other places. But then in the late 60s, the Park Service as a whole had a change in management paradigm. So instead of being like, oh, we're gonna be in the population of ungulates and reducing them directly, they're like, let's sit back and let nature take its course. And they called this natural regulation. And that's like, I totally understand where they were coming from, because we want ecosystems to be natural. But we now know, looking back, that was a pretty bad idea for our park, because we didn't have predators, didn't have hunting, and that elk population, once we stopped regulating them, exploded. And this is a long answer to go back to the part where we had too many elk, and they were living in the park, and they were like having these giant impacts on willow.
What happens when those impacts happen on willow? What's the downstream effects of that, of elk taking out these willow and aspen?
Right. Yeah. So it's the big issue is that they can outcompete with the key ecosystem engineer in these wetlands, which is beaver. And beaver depend on large stem willow, large aspen for food. They eat it, but like most importantly, they use it to make dams. And the dams like raise the water table, cause water to spill over on the landscape, and that essentially creates more willow habitat. So you can think of beavers as kind of willow farmers, so they're like eating it, but they're making more of it. And willow have pretty interesting ecology where their seeds are only viable for like a really short period of time. So like a matter of days. And if that seed that comes out of a willow doesn't land on bare soil, it just dies. And so you need that dynamic water table raising and lowering that beavers create to make more willow. And like going back to the elk, they can eat willow down to the ground and keep willow really small, and those willows just aren't big enough to make dams for beavers. So you don't really think of beavers and elk in competition, but every single time there's a whole bunch of elk there, they will eat the willow to the ground and the beavers lose out.
Wow.
Yeah.
They're farmers and engineers.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, farmers and engineers. Yeah.
Do you think beavers are one of the wildlife species in the park that maybe aren't thought about enough for being able to craft and build such a beautiful environment?
Totally. Yeah. The attention always goes to the big ungulates and bears and mountain lions, but beavers have a bigger impact than all of them when they have healthy populations. Yeah.
Is the population here healthy?
No, it's not. Yeah. So it has been in decline for a long time, and it's a little bit complex and not fully understood why. But we know that, around the time when the park was created, there were like over 1,000, maybe even 1,800 beavers in the park. But now there's almost certainly fewer than 50 beavers, maybe even like fewer than 20 beavers in the park. And for sure, part of the story is competition with elk and just the degradation of wetlands through time. But also there had been a lot of trapping in the past. And there could be other issues, like there's a disease called tularemia, which could be having some effects on beaver populations, maybe predation by things like coyotes, but it's not fully understood why.
Is that something that's starting to or already has been monitored and trying to help the beaver population here?
Yeah, we just had 2 different master's students come through and do 2 projects, one on the west side of the park, one on the east side of the park. And they looked at different aspects of beaver ecology, but part of what they did was just do a pretty good survey of the habitat. And what we can see is that there's not that much good habitat. So the focus is mostly on improving the habitat, because we know there are some beavers around. If we improve the habitat, the hope is their population will expand to fill that area.
And that's where kind of the natural idea comes in, right? To let the natural ecosystem play out. When you let the ecosystem kind of restore it, and then the rest of the natural system should hopefully take place, right?
Yeah, and we often get the question like, why don't you just add beavers? But honestly, it'd be like dropping a beaver in the middle of Saguaro National Park or something like that. Like you have to have food and material. So if we can really heal the process, and then the components should restore themselves.
And if you don't have enough food for them and you drop a bunch in here, eventually the food will completely run out, right? And
that's a concern.
Yeah, and then there'll be no habitat for them at all.
Yeah, so we are making some slow restoration progress with these large ungulate exclosures that we have in the park, which are basically just like mini acre fences that give the vegetation a break. And it has been tempting to be like, oh, there's a lot of willow in this spot, let's add a beaver there or a couple beavers. But like you said, like we could backslide on all that progress if they're eating more willow than they're like making.
It's so interesting.
Yeah.
The downstream effects of, natural areas is always so fascinating. I think obviously people like yourself are thinking about that, but visitors that are coming through, I mean, this might seem like a little story, but it's a major story in this park, correct?
It is. Yeah, it's a huge story. It's probably and I'm biased because it's my area, but I think it's the big natural resource story of the park. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier in the podcast that there's no top predators in the park. What are some of those top predators that may have historically been here and that are missing? And why is it a bad thing that there are no predators here?
Yeah, so we have, in terms of predators right now, we have coyotes, we've got black bears, and we've got mountain lions. Of the three of those, really mountain lions are the only thing that are eating ungulates, like actually hunting and eating ungulates. But historically, the two major players that were eating and regulating elk were wolves, gray wolves, and grizzly bears. And like I said earlier, both of those were extirpated by settlers. And that's just because they were seen as competitors for, ranching interests or for the ungulates that people wanted to eat. So yeah, those are really the only two species that can do this, like the big work of regulating ungulate populations. And people often misunderstand like what exactly they do. But the big thing that they do is that ungulate populations without predators will boom and bust, right? So they will get really, really big. They'll eat all the food on the landscape, and then the population will crash, go really low, and then eventually come back. And predators, by putting a cap on that population, they dampen that effect. So the population will still go up and down, ungulate population, but it's just much more subtle. And it creates a lot more stability in the ecosystem.
That's a perfect example of kind of a natural ecosystem sustaining itself and maintaining itself, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How about, is there, scavengers in the park that are, keeping the ecosystem clean from, you mentioned sick animals earlier. Yeah. Are there, scavengers that are predators in that way, keeping the ecosystem clean?
Yeah, there's a lot of avian scavengers. So we have, magpies, crows, ravens, golden eagles, bald eagles, vultures. They're all going to be scavenging whenever something dies. But then also black bears scavenge a lot. And sometimes I've seen some reports of mountain lions scavenging even. But black bears are probably doing a lot of the scavenging out there. Yeah.
There's been a couple instances around parks and different ecosystems of reintroduction of certain species. North Cascades in the future is working on a project of potentially reintroducing the grizzly bear up there, which is exciting. Wolves have been reintroduced back into the Yellowstone ecosystem some time ago. When those stories occur in those ecosystems, does a park like Rocky Mountain and this ecosystem monitor, the success of those stories, or potentially the maybe not successful stories that occur in those areas? And does that make the park kind of weigh management decisions on doing similar things?
Usually we're just focused on restoring the species. So like in Yellowstone, there was tons of focus on how the wolf population was doing when they restored wolves there. If they restored grizzlies to North Cascades, they'd be really monitoring the population. And so Yellowstone, they had like a really robust monitoring program where they would collar wolves, and then they would make sure that there were collars in every single pack, and then they would do aerial surveys where they'd go and count all the wolves. And they have this great record of the wolf population. There, I know they were also doing tons of ecosystem monitoring, and lots of different university groups also did a lot of ecosystem monitoring. So that would be things like monitoring vegetation, monitoring, following the wolves around and seeing how many ungulates they're killing, that kind of thing. But it also might even go down to like, there's a expectation that if you bring wolves back and stabilize the ecosystem, maybe you get a higher biodiversity of like passerine birds. So you could go do bird surveys and do that kind of work. Yellowstone's a little unique because they have like a ton of resources for that kind of work. In other places, there's more of just the expectation that, we rely on the research from other places that having these members of the ecosystem is just beneficial. And we don't really monitor all the beneficial effects. It's just like, let's get all the pieces here and let the ecosystem function.
Do you have a soft spot for wolves? I think there's a lot of misconception about wolves, and even the reintroduction in Yellowstone, from what I recall, was controversial for a lot of people.
Yeah.
How vital are wolves? And do you have a soft spot for their work in the ecosystem?
Yeah, some of my early fieldwork was following wolves around, tracking wolves and finding the carcasses on the landscape and, taking different measurements to see like what age of elk and moose were they killing on the landscape. And it was a total blast. It was some of the most fun field work I've ever done, winter work. And so, I do have a soft spot, but a big thing that I think you learn when you work with wolves is just how similar they are to people. And I think that is a big reason why we tend to have a lot of conflict with them, is because there's a concept in ecology called like niche space, like ecological niche space. And, different species tend to, when they're competing for niche space, like, have conflict. I think that's what happens, is that we eat the same things. We eat all like ungulates. We like living in the same places, which are tend to be these valley bottoms and beautiful places. And so that's why we see a lot of conflict. So, the other part of your question, they do play a critical role, and it's that dampening of ungulate populations, because ungulates can have, just based on their natural behavior, they can have pretty negative impacts if their populations are unregulated.
And I think another maybe common thing with wolves and humans is just wolves' intelligence and able to work together to accomplish similar missions, which I've always admired about them, and their way to communicate and take on huge projects like taking down, a bison or other, large types of ungulates out in the space. Yeah,
and they're also super adaptable. I mean, they live, in places where they're not constrained by people. They can live all over the place. They're in deserts, they're in the Arctic, they're in mountains, and so they just have an amazing ability to adapt. Yeah. Which is very human-like too.
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. We'll bring it back to Rocky Mountain. What life zones are here? We mentioned the wetlands, but obviously, as we're looking behind us at Long's Peak, a 14er here in Colorado, there's a lot of elevation gain in this park in different areas. Yeah. So what life zones exist in this area?
Yeah, so overall, we're a really high elevation park, so we're like all above 7,000 feet. And mostly people talk about it as 3 different zones. So there's like the montane zone, which goes up to about 9,000 feet. And some of the places that people tend to spend time, so like the big open parks on the east side of the park, and like the term park is like a weird kind of Colorado thing. It's like what would be called a hole in Wyoming is a park here. It's like a broad open valley. So the east side parks, those are all like montane meadows. And then above that, we have the subalpine zone. So that's like 9 to maybe 11,000 feet. And it just ends where the trees stop. Everything above that is alpine. So those are kind of the 3 main zones. And they each add to the landscape in different ways. These montane valleys are super beautiful, and they support, it's like one of the reasons why we have so many rutting elk here in the falls. It's just these big open, beautiful areas. The subalpine area is where like tons of snow accumulates in the winter and slowly melts out and fills all the rivers and lakes, and we have a huge big areas of trees up there. And then the alpine is really one of the main reasons why the park was created. Like about a third of the park is alpine, and we're unique in that we have a super high road, Trail Ridge Road, that goes up through the alpine. So you can actually go up there easily. Like people who can't hike up there can drive up there and see these areas.
And as you kind of go up each one of those layers, what does the mammal species and population start to look like as you get high into the alpines?
Yeah, so it's hard to characterize like all at once because a lot of animals move around. But starting at the top, we have some like alpine adapted species that spend their full time up there. So great examples are pika, which are living up in mostly scree fields. Yellow-bellied marmots are up there. But also like elk are these really migratory animals that go to low elevations in the winter and then go all the way up to the very highest areas in the park in the summer. Not Long's Peak, but like Trail Ridge Road. You can go and see these elk at 11,000, 12,000 feet grazing up there, which is pretty cool. Yeah.
That is cool. How about one of my favorite stories in Colorado is the Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep.
Oh yeah,
and how special they are and being able to traverse landscapes like this. How is their population in the park and what makes them such, adept climbers to be able to survive in such an area like this?
Yeah. So starting with the second part, they have some pretty cool characteristics. They will purposefully spend time in really windy spots because that keeps those areas snow free. And so where we would try to like get behind something and be in the lee, that's also where all the snow accumulates. So they just, they grow these really thick coats and spend time in these windy spots because then they're able to run from predators and not spend a bunch of energy walking through the snow. So it's kind of a cool behavioral adaptation. And then also the thick fur. But in general, for a long time, bighorn sheep were kind of the emblem of Rocky Mountain National Park. And unfortunately, their populations have declined dramatically over the last 100 years or so. And, we suspect that they were like well over 1,000 in the past. And we don't have a really good estimate recently, but they're really, really low. And the biggest reason for that, and it's not just a Rocky thing, it's spread throughout all of North America, is the contagious pneumonias. So the main one is Mycoplasma ovipneumonia, but people call it MOV or MOVI for short. And it's just this contagious disease that comes from domestic sheep, and it has gotten into wild sheep populations all over North America, and it really wreaks havoc on them, unfortunately.
Is that one of the downstream effects of ranches being close by and having those domestic sheep and bighorn sheep interactions?
Yeah, that's the thought, is that the source population is domestic sheep. And so you do get interactions sometimes between domestic sheep and bighorn sheep. But also now it's in, we think, basically all wild sheep populations. And so once it's in wild sheep populations, then just natural migration among sheep populations, just because, young sheep in a saturated population will move. They have a desire, they see a mountain in the distance and they go for that mountain. They can spread the disease. So the genie seems a bit out of the bottle, and now we're having a hard time containing the disease, nationwide.
How would you contain the disease? If you knew a bighorn sheep here had pneumonia, would your team step in to try and cure that?
Well, there's not a known cure. So there has been experimenting with a process called test and remove, where they go and they capture all the sheep one by one in an area. They test them for ovipneumonia, usually one or maybe multiple times, and then they go in and remove the animals that are positive. And that's because the finding has been that there are carriers. So there's animals that can have the disease but not die from it. And when you have carriers in the population, then they tend to transmit it to all the new lambs, and then you have really low lamb survival. So that's been something that they're working on, is test and remove, and maybe that could provide a path forward. Yeah.
One of the most majestic ungulates, in my opinion, is moose. It's always incredible when you see them and their big, beautiful antlers walking with this majestic landscape behind us. How are they doing in Rocky Mountain, and what's their role in this ecosystem? Yeah,
so moose and Rocky are super interesting because all of the recent evidence and historical evidence suggests that we never really had a population in Colorado. So there are historical accounts that they would come down from Wyoming occasionally, but we just it didn't seem like we have a sustaining population. But the state relocated moose from Utah and created a population to the west of the park in the late 70s, like 78, 79. And they have just done super well in Colorado. Their populations have expanded dramatically throughout the entire state. And so now Colorado has the southernmost population of moose in North America. And, the estimate is that it's like well over 3,500 moose statewide now. And that's been mirrored in the park, just expansion throughout the entire park, and the populations have done really well. And it's exciting. Visitors are super excited to see them. It does make our wetland restoration much more difficult. We've done some math about how much willow they eat compared to elk, and it turns out that partially because they're bigger bodied, for every single moose, each moose is equivalent to about 15 elk of eating willow. So when it comes to restoring willow, they are presenting a pretty big challenge for us.
Wow.
Yeah.
And what predates on moose in the park?
I would say maybe sometimes mountain lions will eat them, but mountain lions also have access to a lot of elk. So if they have the choice, they'll probably go after elk. We are starting a mortality study to really nail this and try to understand what's killing moose in the park. But mostly they don't have predators, and we don't have hunting's illegal in the park. So they're free to live and eat, hang out in the park.
You just mentioned a mountain lion would likely choose an elk. Is that just based on energy and how much they would expend going after an elk versus a moose?
I think exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think opportunistically they would kill a moose, if it was sick or injured, or they just had a perfect ambush situation. But elk are just easier prey. I think it's true for wolves too. In places that have all three species, like Yellowstone, they eat like 95% elk, even though there are moose around. So, what would you go after,
Some smaller, easier.
Exactly. Yeah.
Before we started this podcast, I showed you this video in my campground last night of a herd of elk, but one was laying on the ground, and another came up and just whacked it, just stomped on it, and got the other one up. And I was curious, you being an ecologist and being able to study these types of interactions, and you had mentioned it was just two young bulls playing with each other. And it brings up an interesting point, because sometimes I think we overcomplicate wildlife and their behavior.
Right. Yeah.
But is that just an instance of, they're not as much different than us than we might think in terms of play and having fun?
Yeah, I think if you spend enough time watching wildlife, then you see a lot of things that maybe you could get complicated and be like, oh, it's behavior to learn this other behavior. But yeah, animals play, and play does serve a purpose, for humans too. Like, we learn through play, and I think that's what animals are doing. But sometimes I do think that they're just like, oh, I'm gonna step on my buddy over here and see what happens. Yeah.
Do you see that more often in the younger males?
Yeah, I think younger males or just young of all species tend to do more play. That's true for people too. Yeah.
Yeah, and the bullying of each other.
Yeah, the bowling. Yeah,
earlier in the podcast,
they could be siblings. You never know. Yeah.
Earlier in the podcast, you brought up the yellow-bellied marmot, which arguably has like the best life. They just eat and sleep all day long. Right. Do they add a whole lot to the ecology of this area, or are they, is their purpose served as prey?
Yeah, I mean, I'm reluctant to say that they don't play a big role, because so much of what we know is just like where we've looked, and maybe not enough attention has been paid to yellow-bellied marmots. But I'd say that they're much less impactful compared to things like beavers that have this outsized role compared to their numbers. But they, all of these smaller animals. So I think we have 68 mammals in the park, and a whole bunch of those are like rodents, small rodents, and things like yellow-bellied marmots. And those things play a role. They're consuming vegetation, but they're also like being food for some of the higher profile animals like coyotes and golden eagles, things like that. Yeah.
When you recreate in these high elevation alpine tundra environments, you're destined to hear the sound of a pika.
Yeah.
And people in the Park Service, park rangers, seem to absolutely love pika. What makes them special, and how are they able to survive in such rugged, high alpine terrain?
Yeah, they're cool, and I think that they really capture people's imaginations, partially because they announce their presence. Like when you go into the alpine, they do these loud alarm calls, and so you could be kind of in the zone walking through some scree, and then you hear this call and you're like, oh, there's a cool animal over there, and you look for it and find it. So that's part of it. But also they, unlike yellow-bellied marmots, which hibernate, they don't hibernate. They collect a ton of vegetation. They make these stores underground, and then they can slowly eat that through time. And they also have some pretty wild adaptations where they collect a lot of vegetation that has chemical compounds that are poisonous, and they this isn't my research, this is just what I've read, is that they can stack that vegetation in a way that the stuff that needs time to degrade will degrade before they consume it. So they've got these cool little behaviors like that.
How often do you and your team get calls of sick animals in the park, and what's your response time to be able to get out there and assess the situation and get that animal back out into the ecosystem?
Yeah, so it tends to happen mostly in the summer, and I think the big part of that is just there's more eyes out there, and people are out there noticing things. Right now, we're getting a whole bunch of calls about sick bats, and we think that's because there's a disease that is throughout North American hibernating bats called white-nose syndrome, and we just found out last year that we have it in the park. We have the bug that causes it. And what tends to happen when it shows up in a place for the first time, and we're seeing detections in different parts of the state right now, is that there's more and more interactions with people as sick bats start behaving differently than they naturally would. And so we are seeing an uptick in the number of bats that are seen, and we do go out there, and oftentimes we can get out there super quickly. But if there's many calls stacked on top of each other, then we triage and we go to the calls that are most urgent.
Are you able to cure that illness in the bats?
No, they're working on vaccinations, but once a bat is sick, there's not a whole lot that we do. And in general, we are pretty hands-off. We try to let nature take its course for the most part. The exceptions are if an animal gets injured because of something that we did. So say we put out a fence, like that orange fencing that's sometimes used for snow fences. If an elk gets tangled up in that, we really try our best to handle that elk and get it back into working order. But if another example, if a rope gets caught up in an antler and it looks like it's stable and it's not preventing that elk from moving or eating, then we'll probably just leave it be.
This park is really popular. As you mentioned, 4 million visitors here in this park. You also mentioned that there's not a ton of space for animals to roam in this park. Oftentimes they could leave. Because of that, what's the importance of visitors staying away from wildlife? I know with a lot of visitors, and you see these majestic ungulates in the park, it could be tempting to pull out your phone and run up to them and take a photo. Right. But what are the downstream effects of encroaching on these animals' habitat?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's, our park gets over 4 million visitors. And so one thing I always tell people is that it's super easy to think that you as an individual is not having an effect, but even a small effect, because we have so many visitors, can accumulate and have impacts. And so I just think that should encourage people to be extra cautious. And being too close to wildlife is one of those areas that's tricky, because oftentimes we don't know we're too close until the animal leaves. Right. And so that's why we give out the guidelines, and we use bus links to help people understand this. We give out the guidelines that you should never be closer than 2 bus lengths from any species, but specifically elk and bighorn sheep, and then 3 bus lengths from bears and moose. And that's just because bears and moose are a little bit more sensitive. If we start seeing more wolf activity in the park, then the guideline for that is 100 yards, just because they're still an endangered species in Colorado, and so we want to give them that extra space. So that's just a guideline, though. The thing that I always tell people is that if an animal looks at you or changes its behavior because of you, then you're too close. And that doesn't mean go get close until they change their behavior. We should stay 2 or 3 bus lengths, but maybe move back if an animal seems nervous because of us. Yeah.
We oftentimes talk about grizzly bears and black bears being habituated to humans and wanting food. Are ungulates, do they behave in similar ways if they receive food, or are they really just focused on the vegetation around them?
They definitely can get habituated. A lot of the ungulates in the park are more habituated than ungulates elsewhere, and it's just because we do have a ton of visitation. And it's not really a bad thing. It's not as big of an issue for ungulates compared to grizzly bears and black bears, because grizzly bears and black bears can eat all of our food. And so there's that kind of toxic relationship of them getting human foods and then becoming habituated and getting too close to humans. And that can result in unfortunately them being killed because they're getting too close to people. Ungulates don't eat Fritos. Maybe they would like them, but since they don't do it, they can get habituated, but it doesn't have that food reward issue.
Do bighorn sheep, do they have, their salt caves and salt mines up in the mountains?
Yeah, so I don't know about up in the mountains, but Sheep Lakes, which is on the east side of the park here, the thought is that they come all the way down the mountain out to Sheep Lakes because they're eating minerals down there. So they must be mineral limited if they're making that trek down to lower areas to eat salt.
You've spent a lot of time in a lot of places studying some amazing species and have done amazing work with them. When you explore a park like Rocky Mountain, are you able to find peace and step away from the work and enjoy the beauty of a place like this?
Yeah, I am. I think I mentioned earlier that I have a 2-year-old daughter, and that really helps because you get to see everything through, a toddler's eyes, and everything's amazing. I know we call it in natural resources like the curse of knowing. And the one way that always crops up is with exotic plant species, because people, can be like, oh, this is the most amazing place. And those who know might be like, yeah, but there's invasive whatever right there. And so that is a little bit of a curse. Like right now I can see that there's some cheatgrass there, and after we're done, I'll pick it. But yeah, besides that, no, I'm definitely able to appreciate these places for sure. Yeah.
Have you ever been out, exploring and noticed a sick animal and, got to work and calling your team or doing your best to try and help it out?
Yeah, I mean, I try as much as possible to carry a radio while I'm in the park in case something, and that's usually because of if there's something going on with people. But if there was some issue that I came up with, then yeah, I would rally the group and go out there and do something. But the situations where we do act are pretty rare. So like a good example is there was someone called in about a moose that had eaten some fishing line. And so there was like some fishing line hanging out of its mouth. That's obviously a bad thing that we wish wouldn't happen, but it's a good example of a situation where we just don't have very good options. We could go out and try to anesthetize the moose, but anesthesia isn't risk-free for animals. And so we'd have to weigh the benefits, the costs. And the hope in that case was that the moose just naturally passes that fishing line. It was a moose that we had put a collar on by chance. And so we have been able to track it remotely and see that it still seems to be moving around, so it's okay. But yeah.
That's a great point you bring up of the collaring of the moose. I watched a recent presentation of yours, and you were showing moose movement in the area and how really they stay in vegetation zones for a while. But what have you learned here in the park about the moose that are collared here?
Yeah, so some of it's not very surprising. Just that moose tend to really focus on areas with good willow populations in the summer. One of the cool things that we've learned is that almost all ungulates will go down in elevation during the winter, and it makes sense. Let's go to a place with less snow, but moose here will go up in elevation. So they'll go up into that subalpine zone, which is a little confusing because it's colder, it's snowier, and there's it's just like mostly dense forest, but it works really well for them. I think it's an adaptation, an anti-predator adaptation. They go up and they tend to be more isolated, and they're just hard to find, and they tend to stay in these spots and just eat subalpine fir during the winter. So that's kind of a cool, interesting thing that they do. As
a researcher, when you learn those types of adaptations, does it always wow you?
For sure. Yeah, it's never surprising. Like, that they do a lot of cool stuff. It's neat to get a little insight into what those adaptations are.
I think I talked to you off camera about John Waller, and I've talked about it a couple of times in this podcast, and his belief that animals have secret lives, and people like yourself, ecologists and biologists that are in the field, get a little glimpse into that secret life of animals.
Right.
Do you have the same philosophy of, wildlife? We just need to know enough about them to keep them safe, but we don't need to know everything? For sure. And there's no problem with that continuing, because the amount of effort we put into getting a tiny insight. So like, we spend tons of time and energy and effort learning, say, how big of a population there is of X, but we just don't get to do that much else, and that's totally fine. It's like we need to know what we need to know to manage them and know more. And it's cool to learn the little tidbits, but it's neat to just go out there and watch an animal and
and speculate about what could be going on and not know. There's so much mystery out there, even though we're working really hard to understand these animals. And I find comfort in that. It's nice.
What do you want to tell visitors about if they're visiting this national park? What's something that they need to know? We talked about distance with wildlife, but
Right.
how can they, be proactive in making sure that, their actions in the park mitigate risk of, endangering wildlife?
Yeah, I mean, I think a thing that often happens to visitors is that they come to a place like this that does have lots of vegetation, especially on the roads. It can feel a bit, people can kind of forget that they're in this place with wild animals, and it can feel a bit like all of a sudden they're at a zoo, and I think that does themselves a disservice because it cheapens the experience of seeing these wild animals. And it could also make it tempting to treat it like a zoo, like going and getting close to animals or leaving trash out because someone's going to come pick it up. And I think it's better to think about it as like this is a shared place that we all together have in our country, and we all have to be stewards of it and be really careful with the wildlife and treat it really, really well when we're there.
What's your favorite part about this park and working in it?
I love the alpine. Like alpine is my favorite, and that's why I loved working in Alaska as well. But just being high up where you can see super far, it's like my favorite spot by far. And this park has lots of alpine. The other thing is that there's a lot of places that are busy in the park, but it's just amazing that you just walk a little bit, like even 1 mile, and there's almost nobody there. You walk 2 hours and it's like you have this place to yourself, and that's pretty cool that you can access those areas pretty well.
I agree. We talked a little bit about this, but how does weather change the ecology in this park from the winter months all the way into the summer?
Yeah, so one big effect is that in general we get weather from west to east, and so we get a little bit more snow on the higher elevation west side of the park and a little bit less on the east side of the park. So that does affect things like what plants are in different areas, where animals spend time in the winter, especially. That's probably the biggest effect. Yeah.
Well, as we begin to wind this podcast down, I do want to give you the floor to talk about anything we haven't discussed or something that's on your mind, whether it's the ecology of this park or, encouragement for people to come and visit this amazing place.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the cool things about the national park system is that we have everything from these little historic parks. We've got vast Alaskan parks that get little visitation. And then we've got these places in the middle that have easy access from a place like Denver and also wild places. So I think it's just a great park to dip your toes into wilderness and wildness. And so I think it's a good spot to begin your park journey if you don't spend very much time in parks.
Well, thank you for all the work that you do with the amazing wildlife that's in this park and all the research, and for sharing, everything that you've learned so far here in this park and all the amazing work that you and your team do. So thank you.
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, thanks for spending your time doing this podcast.
Thanks for checking out this edition of the Safe Travels podcast. I really hope you enjoyed it. Will and his work here are both so incredible, and I'm so thankful that we had a chance to sit down and chat with him. So if you like this type of content, it'd mean a whole lot to me if you liked, commented, and subscribed. And until next time, safe travels.